the institution of chemical engineers and Economics Society in the UK, the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering in Melbourne. And now in semi-retirement, he provides consultancy support for the not-for-profit sector on governance, management of change, recruitment and strategic direction. He's also maintained links with UCL as an honorary fellow and a visiting professor. And he's going to talk to us about the emergence of the chemical engineer as a profession.
Thank you very much. I've got to keep you awake and stop you running away. These are the two tasks of a graveyard slot at the moment. I also have a challenge in that I find there are both engineers and chemists in the room. So the normal strategy for a chemical engineer to talk about chemistry to other engineers and engineering to chemists is not open to me. What is this thing, chemical engineering? Well, you can look in Wikipedia and you'll see a definition of chemical engineering based on molecular change, materials change, heat transfers, mass transfers, and whatever. But I wanted something much simpler, and I went to a school contemporary of mine who later on became president of IChemE, and I said, "What's chemical engineering?" He said, "Well, it's what chemical engineers do." But there is, and this is a good definition to have, because it means the discipline can expand as much as you want it to, and it gives the excuse for chemical engineering taking on new areas all the time. And that was evidenced earlier this year, I think, by the Royal Academy of Engineering's £1 million prize. They gave it to a chemical engineer, Robert Langer from MIT. And what did he do? Well, he works on the delivery using engineered polymers of large molecular weight drugs for mental illness, for cancer. It's all part of the new chemical engineering, so we keep expanding the frontiers. But this definition also gives us problems, because then we say, well, did chemical engineering exist before chemical engineers existed? Because there are things going on in the early 19th century or late 18th century, which clearly chemical engineers would claim as their own. I have an interest in retirement in sugar slavery, and as a subject, it contributed enormously to chemical engineering technology. The filter press, the centrifuge, evaporation in vacuum, multiple effect evaporators, all came out of that industry. And they're all thought of today as part of chemical engineering. But we're no chemical engineers. And the same is true of all the developments in the 19th century of the large-scale chemical industry. No chemical engineers. And we have to get to about 1839 before there's even a reference in the English language to something called chemical engineering. My French colleagues tell me that Lavoisier wrote about chemical engineering 50 years before, but again, it depends on how you do the translation. So let's get to 1878. And the man with the prototypical beard of the period, as we heard this morning, all these gentlemen had to have beards at the time, and this is George E. Davis, who's the father of chemical engineering, as far as the British see it. He was an analyst, and finally got a job as an alkali inspector under the Alkali Acts, whose job was to, of course, clean up the chemical industry. This gentleman called himself a chemical engineer. He also tried to establish a society of chemical engineers in 1878, but when they had a meeting with about a dozen people there, somebody put his hand up and had an amendment, and the Society of Chemical Industry was founded instead. So no Society of Chemical Engineers came out of that. But Davis started to give lectures at Manchester Tech, on what he called chemical engineering. He also found a publisher, and the lectures were given in the Chemical Trades Journal. He found it easy to find a publisher because he published it. And the book, and later on, his great seminal work, 2 great big thick volumes called Handbook of Chemical Engineering, were based on those lectures. That came out in 1901. And after that, chemical engineering in Britain, not much at all. And we have to look to the United States to start to understand what is happening in chemical engineering as a discipline, as an organised profession, as an activity. And of course we have to go to MIT, which is where the famous Class 10 started in chemical engineering in the late 1880s. They graduated 7 people. By 1907 they awarded their first PhD in chemical engineering. And in 1908 the American Institute of Chemical Engineers was formed, with several hundred members. In Britain, no interest in industry, little interest in academia, other than 1 or 2 pioneers who were trying to establish a discipline. One of the leaders of industry described chemical engineers as being of doubtful and indescribable people. And then we come to war. War, 4th of August 1914, this country lurches into war. And immediately we find there's a bit of a problem. Britain hadn't gone to war in continental Europe for 100 years, since Waterloo. And colonial wars were a very poor preparation for what is about to happen. The last major conflict, Second Boer War. But we are now onto a totally different scale of operation. And Sir John French, who was the commander of the British Expeditionary Force, wrote back to government, the problem set is a simple one. Munitions, always more munitions. Asquith had appointed Kitchener to the War Office, and what did the government do? They established a committee. And that committee was to look at the question of supply of explosives. Now we've already heard today that the chemical industry in Britain was at a disadvantage to Germany and to the United States. Backward. There's no other way of describing it. It imported large quantities from our friends in Germany, Austria, and the United States. 2 of them pretty belligerent powers and 1 a non-belligerent power, but certainly not in on our side at the time. And we had other supplies coming from very long supply lines. We heard again about guano from Chile for saltpeter. All at enormous risk in terms of supply chain, torpedoing boats, things of that kind. Kitchener realised as much as the others, as Sir John French in the field, but again it was this issue of explosives. By the end of the war, we were producing shells in these quantities, munitionettes, supplying and filling the shells. But we were in no position to do this at the outset of war. No possibility at all. The army had only just changed over from picric acid to TNT as its favoured high explosive. The old picric acid lyddite was unstable and unhelpful, and TNT was a major way forward. However, how were we going to get the toluene to actually produce the TNT? The Defence of the Realm Act was passed and they nationalised the coal tar industry. All output of coal tar, which had previously gone to dyestuffs, immediately came into the field of the munitions industry. Now, I said we established a committee. And here's the man who chaired the committee. Now, he is a Victorian gentleman, isn't he? He's a 70-year-old law lord, and he is quite exceptional. He is one of those you can claim amongst non-fighting people as being one of those who won the war. Who was he? He was the son of a Methodist minister. He was an outstanding mathematician. He passed first in all England in the Oxford and Cambridge school examination. He couldn't go to Cambridge at that point, because he wouldn't commit to the 39 Articles of the Church of England as a Methodist. And he went to UCL, he graduated there, had a short period as a teacher, and then decided he could accept these 39 Articles. He went to Cambridge, to St John's, and he passed first out of all people in the final mathematics tripos, and therefore became senior wrangler. Now that, he had the biggest gap in his attainment between senior wrangler and the man who came second. It was George Darwin, the naturalist's son, who later became professor of mathematics at Cambridge. The gap between Moulton and Darwin was the largest that had ever been seen. This is a quite extraordinary man. What did he decide he wanted to do? He became a patent lawyer. But in the evenings, he helped the President of the Royal Society do experiments on electrical discharges in gases. And he got an FRS for that. He went off to Paris to deal with the first development of SI units, and he got a companion of the Legion of Honour for that. And then at home, he worked as a patent lawyer, getting involved in technical issues. The Marconi case, Nobel's explosives cordite case, dye-stuffs cases were all ones in which he participated. And when he was appointed to this job, he showed enormous energy. He immediately established an office on the top floor of the mechanicals building in Birdcage Walk. He never took a lift. He used to run up every morning all the stairs at 70. And I'm sorry, I'm just going to look and see how many days it was. In 19 days, he wrote his report about munitions and supply. He was immediately asked to head the munitions industry for Britain through the war, the so-called Department A6, the War Office. He was empowered under the Defence of the Realm Act with nationalising any industry on which he put his finger and wanted to take over. Toluene was the limiting factor, as I said, and this was going to be a big problem. He needed both more propellants and he needed more explosives. This is a scale-up of a kind which hadn't been seen in peacetime ever. Now, scale-up, that's something to do with chemical engineering, isn't it? But we haven't got any of them in Britain. So he turned to another individual who was recommended to him. And now we come to my other hero, Kenneth Bingham Quinlan, KBQ. He always called himself KBQ, and so did his staff. Now, he's a modern man, no facial hair, not that much hair altogether. Anyway, he's 36 years old when he arrives. He arrives from South Africa. He's American. He's a self-taught chemical engineer who has established the Cape Explosives Factory in Somerset West in South Africa, second biggest explosives factory in the world. He was trained by his uncle, who was the first general manager, and in his 20s he was appointed to succeed his uncle when his uncle died on a trip to Australia. Quinlan was telegraphed in December 1914, "Will you come?" He caught the Union Castle steamer the same day, together with various materials for him to work on, and he came, and the cost to De Beers were given £4,000 a year for his services. He received almost all that himself. The second highest paid engineer at the time was £250 a year within the distribution. This caused some resentment and some trouble with the Treasury all the way through the war, but this man deserved every penny. Conan Doyle wrote that he had the drive of a steam piston. And my goodness, he made people work. He assembled a team from Australia, South Africa, and Britain, and they set about establishing a world-class munitions industry. He was robust of style and approach. He never worked comfortably in committees. Other people in the organisation had to deal with that. He left such tasks to Moulton, and he got on with the job, designing factories and calling for increased production from other facilities. He upset British sensibilities When he had all the general managers of plants together, he told them that they were turning their plants into bloody constipated caterpillars. This was not the language which British senior people expected at the time. He wrote the most robust memos. You can find them in the National Archives today. There's 280 boxes of files of Quinlan's papers, all the drawings and everything else. He was a hands-on organiser, also patented inventions, processes, the Quinlan stove, so his bed system for call-out production, saved a fortune from that. Happily, Moulton had contributed one other major contribution in his own thinking about explosives. He realised that you were never going to get enough TNT, and his decision was to mix with ammonium nitrate. And that was amatol, the explosive which was used almost entirely by the British Army and later by the Royal Navy for the preferred explosive for the First World War. They managed 40 to 60 and 60 to 40 mixtures of ammonium nitrate and TNT, and this became the explosive, as I say, the explosive of choice. Quinlan's first task was to complete the design and construction of a TNT plant at Oldbury. His methods have been described as meticulous, and it was, but my goodness, he also put a sharp stick behind everybody who worked in it. A million bricks were laid in 19 days, and in 100 days, the plant was up and running. This was associated with the Chance and Hunt facilities at Oldbury, which were immediately taken over by Quinlan and nationalised. At the same time, he was organising the dismantling of the Rotterdam distillation units owned by Royal Dutch. These were re-erected in Barrow-in-Furness and Avonmouth, and that immediately, as a stroke, increased tolling production enormously. And at this stage, he would be turning his mind to the two next factories for which he's really well known. But of course, politics then intervene, and we have the Shell crisis. The Shell crisis this was already probably being solved by Department A6, but politically it became very important. The Times published reports that the British Army didn't have enough munitions. Probably true. Asquith government wobbled, and the Welsh wizard, David Lloyd George, was appointed Minister of Munitions, moving from being Chancellor of the Exchequer, quite high up in the government, to this new role, Ministry of Munitions, which showed the absolute importance of this activity. At the Battle of Neuve Chapelle in 1915, in a 35-minute bombardment, more shells were fired than had been fired in the whole of the Second Boer War. This is the scale of what is happening in terms of the need to get more and more production going. And the solution to the production problem was to build on greenfield sites the two largest chemical factories ever produced in Britain. We heard about Billingham, we know about Milton, etc. But the two establishments which were built, you can go and see now, are essentially greenfield sites again, were one on the Welsh border in Flintshire, Sandycroft and Queensferry, and the other one on the Anglo-Scottish border at Gretna. Let me give you some statistics of what these two factories were to do. By early 1916, Sandycroft and Queensferry were in operation. These are major facilities for nitric acid, sulfuric acid, spent acid recovery for TNT, and nitrocellulose production. Quinlan signed off every design. When you look in the files, there are elucidations in the margins. KBQ is written on all the designs, hundreds and hundreds of blueprints. It cost just over £4 million to build Queensferry. The workforce peaked at 7,000, who were 2,500 of which were female. During all wartime operations, 4 people died on that site. When we come to Gretna, which came online some months later, this is 9,000 acres between Gretna and Eastring. 19 kilometres long. Gretna was to produce cordite, a mixture of gun cotton and nitroglycerine kneaded together. I'll come back to that, gentlemen. This is Gretna under construction. And this is how they mixed the cordite. This is the Devil's Porridge. There's a museum up in Gretna called the Devil's Porridge Museum. This is cordite. They had 16,500 workers at Gretna, 11,000 of which were female. They built the townships, a coal-fired power station, a bakery producing 14,000 meals a day, a laundry processing 6,000 items a day, treated 10 million gallons of water, treating and filtering. They had a bit of a labour problem and they nationalised the pubs. Alcohol sales were curtailed. It had its own hospital, and they lost 3 people on that site during the whole of the war to accident. Now, I suspect it was occupational health deaths, which weren't recorded in the same way, but nonetheless, it was a tribute. We heard this morning, was it this afternoon, about deaths at Brunamond and Silvertown in 73 were lost. In all, about 600 munition workers were lost during the First World War. 134 in Chiltern was a shell filling factory. Shell filling is incredibly dangerous. And 140 went to Davisham when the TNT store went up. But the plants which Quinlan was responsible, almost no loss of life due to accident. These are some of Quinlan's flow sheets. It's for Gretna. Don't know how much you can make it out, but this is the methodical way in which he was working on heat transfer processes, etc. All drawn up originally in sketches by him and then drawn up by a draft. It's quite a story. By the end of the war, there were 32 factories operating directly under the Explosives Supply Department, of which Quinlan was director of factories. 218 factories were started up with the construction paid for by government, but were still run by private companies responsible to Quinlan. He was also, before the end of the war, responsible as well as for the earlier materials, ammonium nitrate, calcium nitrate, ammonium perchlorate, phenol, for the nitric acid, acetone, all soap operations for glycerol, distillation of industrial alcohol. He also became responsible for mustard gas, chlorine, and phosgene. Moulton certainly was very unhappy that that production came into the explosives department, and they were heavily criticised for us getting slow off the mark in terms of our response to the Germans. As to whether this was slow off the mark because they were reluctant to do it or not isn't altogether clear. That's again one of the drawings for condensing towers at Glen. There was a gentleman earlier on who I skipped past very much of the time, with his monocle. This is Quinlan's equivalent in the Navy. He built the Hilton Heath Cordite factory, Frederick Nathan, and he has a part in the later part of this story. He wasn't too happy to be transferred under Quinlan's authority originally when the Navy and Army activities were brought together, but in fact he dealt with the committees which Quinlan couldn't deal with, and they had tremendous mutual respect by the end. He's one of 4 Jewish brothers, all of whom were knighted for different services during the First World War and for Empire. Interesting character. He also was responsible for introducing Weitzman to Lloyd George and Churchill and attended meetings rather different about Zionism. And at one stage, when Weizmann wanted to go to Switzerland to recruit additional staff for his factories, Milton and Quillen locked his passport in the safe of the mechanicals and refused to let it out for Weizmann to travel, because there were thoughts that he wasn't actually, he was pursuing Zionism rather than industrial microbiology at the time. Lloyd George went mad and threatened to dismiss Quillen and Milton, or at least he made a show of saying to sack them. What the truth is, goodness knows. But Nathan was other than Quillen, was the technical man for the time. He'd been the superintendent of the Woolwich Arsenal and also been superintendent of Waltham Abbey, which was the government's explosives factory. Well, I talked about scale up and production. There should actually be a very, very thin grey line on the first 1914 column. Actually, the 14 column is not quite the same because it's August to December. It's wartime production. But nonetheless, the increase in production over the years of war is quite phenomenal. Explosives, TNT and the ammonium nitrate and cordite for propellant. So, around 1917, the Americans became very interested in getting Quillen back. He was an American citizen. What did the British government do? They gave him £10,000 as an honorarium. That's a purchasing power of about £2.5 million today. And he stayed. He did go across later as a consultant to the American government because they were frightened that DuPont were profiteering out of the war with sales of explosives to Britain, and they wanted an independent person to run the slide rule over the DuPont operation, and Quillen did that. He also received, he was offered a knighthood, but as an American citizen couldn't accept and wouldn't accept, and he became one of the first 17 Companions of Honour, which was instituted by George V in 1917. Amongst the others were Jan Smuts, the South African Prime Minister at the time, who was a member of the War Cabinet, various industrialists, trade unionists, and other personalities. Quillen was gazetted as the special services to the nation. Chemical engineering was certainly a special service at the time. When the war ended, he was given, there were many offers for him to stay, but he went back to South Africa. He married a girl half his age, and after 2 or 3 years more, he set up as a grape farmer, producing table grapes. He did return to the colours in the Second World War at the explosives factories in South Africa, but that was his contribution. Now, was it a loss? We talked. Now let's get back to chemical engineering. He always called himself a chemical engineer, and he clearly inspired those who worked with him. And although his legacy is not direct in terms of establishing a professional body for chemical engineers, it was the people he left behind who did. His reports were written up and published. 1921, Ministry of Munitions, Department of Explosives Supply, preliminary studies for Gretna and phosgene manufacture. There were in all 9 hardback volumes, which were produced by him: sulfuric acid, nitric acid, phenol, production, etc. These are design guides. They became textbooks for aspirant chemical engineers in terms of design. They were republished in the United States by Van Nostrand, and had enormous sales over there as well. He was held in enormously high regard. The discipline was still developing in America very fast. MIT by 1916 had, after D. Little, had coined unit operations and unit processes, and you had transfer processes from McAdams and Walker at the time. There's no equivalent activity in Britain at all. You've got Professor of Physical Chemistry at UCL, Donnan, trying to do the Harbour process, Harbour-Bosch process, without, as we heard, without success. Quinlan was also associated with that work and had recommended the purchase of the site. Moving on, McNabb and Creamer were two people who produced the textbooks. They edited the things and started agitating towards having an institution of chemical engineers. They wanted a qualifying body for chemical engineers. The trouble was, there weren't very many chemical engineers to qualify. And so we get a chicken and egg situation as to how to actually establish a profession without many people who are obviously there or thereabouts. There was resistance, of course, from the other engineering institutions. I see Malcolm's just left, but the IEE were one of those who objected to an IChemE. As to the mechanicals, as to the civils, and as did Reimer, the then big four of the engineering profession. Nathan tried to get the Chemical Society interested, or the Royal Institute, the Institute of Chemistry, as it was then, interested in the Institution of Chemical Engineers. But none of it actually worked. Nonetheless, Nathan, McNabb, and others fought on, and in the end, in 1922, an institution was established. Now, the reason I got this up, it's not the crest with which it operates today, etc., or logos it operates today, but it's clearly the reference to chemistry on the left, mechanical engineering on the right, but a very, very thin sapling indeed in the middle. This is no oak. This is a sapling with a strong stake beside it. Nonetheless, the discipline grew. I can list of the first 19 presidents, 11 had been associated with the Ministry of Munitions. The first president was Duckham. Duckham had been in the Ministry of Munitions as a controller of munitions devices and had known Quinlan intimately. Second president was Nathan, who we've seen. And it goes on and on. Each one of them was a president. Now, what had happened to Moulton? Moulton had actually spent a lot of time trying to establish an institute, promoting and supporting. He went up and down the country, giving lectures at Sheffield, Cambridge, London, etc., on the need for chemical engineers. However, in 1921, when he'd been asked to be a founding member of the institution, he was already an honorary fellow of the other three, the other three, Gallicus and lectures. But he was asked to come into IChemE. The next day, his valet found him dead in bed after sitting in the House of Lords. So Moulton is a lost soul from a profession, but nonetheless a remarkable man. Lacking a certain candour, it says in his obituary, but apart from that, someone quite special. The influence of Quinlan continues even after the Second World War. I've talked about the presidents in this first phase, but after the war, we've got Creamer, who'd been his executive assistant, became the president of IChemE in 1947. And in even as late as the 1950s, Sir Harold Hartley, who'd been in charge of gas warfare in the First War, and had argued with Quinlan about phosgene production, became president of IChemE in the 1950s. So this link with the Ministry of Munitions goes on for 35 years or so. The institution itself, a weak sapling indeed. First professor of chemical engineering in Britain, 1923 at UCL, American trained, MIT, chemical engineer. But there very little in by way of courses or intake into courses. There's no great surge as in America in terms of getting chemical engineers. You top up the one-year courses, topping up other engineers, topping up chemists, etc. Not until 1937 is there a degree course at UCL. Indeed, although I write the story about chemical engineering and the First World War and how it all happens, you have to wait for another war before it actually really takes off in the immediate aftermath of that Second War. Chemical engineering is a child of war as far as the British profession is concerned, because it's only in the early 1940s that the desperate need for chemical engineers is recognised governmentally, and after the war, the large shelling down to Cambridge and Courtaulds to Imperial and conversion of oil engineering to Birmingham, gas engineering at Leeds and things of that kind all begin. You get an enormous expansion of numbers. And then the influence of the nuclear industry as well as being a major driver. But the story up to the end of the First World War, I leave you with a weak sample. Any questions?
That's absolutely marvellous, and everything in the world I most want